hardly a surprising piece of advice from a corporate lawyer. Moreover, I'm aware of no unlawful collusion with or direction from any government agency or political campaign on how Twitter should have handled the Hunter Biden laptop situation. Even though many disagree with how Twitter handled the Hunter Biden matter, I believe that the public record reveals that my client acted in a manner that was fully consistent with the First Amendment. I think that the best reading of the law is that as a private entity, the First Amendment protects Twitter and its content moderation decisions. And I do not believe that the facts in the public record indicate that Twitter became a state actor, as that concept is defined under existing precedent, such that the First Amendment would have constrained it. Second, I believe that at all times I executed my duties and responsibilities to my client, Twitter, lawfully and ethically. At no time was I an agent or operative of the government or any political actor when I worked at Twitter. To the contrary, I believe that I worked zealously and diligently within the bounds of the law in pursuit of my client's best interests. Third, I did not destroy or improperly suppress any documents at Twitter regarding information important to the public dialogue. At all times, I sought to help my client understand and comply with its legal obligations. It is worth noting that the public record indicates that after I left the company, attorneys or other unidentified third parties collected and/or reviewed the contents of at least some of the Twitter files prior to their release. Fourth, Twitter disclosed publicly emails between me and Yoel Roth regarding one of Donald Trump's tweets about COVID. I do not have access to my Twitter emails, so I do not know if or how I responded to Mr. Roth. To the best of my recollection, I do not recall directing or urging him to take action with respect to Mr. Trump's tweet. Instead, what I recall is that I asked him a question so that I could better understand how he and others were implementing Twitter's COVID misinformation policy. Asking questions and learning more about what a client's activities are is what I think good lawyers should do, and again, hardly surprising. Fifth, the Twitter files reference prior investigations of me. It is true that the Department of Justice investigated certain aspects of my conduct while I was employed by the FBI related to the handling of certain information. Because I believe in the accountability for government officials, I cooperated with the Department, including sitting for lengthy interviews. Eventually, the Department closed the matter. No adverse action was taken with respect to me, and my security clearances while a government employee were never restricted because of the matter. In closing, Mr. Chairman, I want to return briefly to the general topic of government interaction with social media companies. The law permits the government to have complex, multifaceted, and long-term relationships with the private sector. Law enforcement agencies and companies can engage with each other regarding, for example, compulsory legal process served on companies, criminal activity that companies, the government, or the public identify, such as crimes against children, cybersecurity threats, and terrorism, and instances where companies themselves are victims of crime. When done properly, these interactions can be beneficial to both sides and in the interests of the public. As you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Jordan, and others have proposed, a potential workable way to legislate in this area may be to focus on the actions of federal government agencies and officials with respect to their engagement with the private sector. Congress may be able to limit the nature and scope of those interactions in certain ways, require enhanced transparency and reporting by the executive branch about its engagements, and require higher-level approvals within the executive branch prior to such engagements on certain topics, so that you can hold Senate-confirmed officials, for example, accountable for those decisions. In any event, if you want to legislate, my recommendation is to focus first on reasonable and effective limitations on government actors. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Ms. Gaddy.
Chairman Comer, Ranking Member Raskin, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to provide this opening statement. After a decade as a corporate lawyer, I joined Twitter in 2011 as the first member of the corporate legal team. In 2013, I was promoted to general counsel. In 2018, I became the chief legal officer and continued in that role until October of 2022. During my time at Twitter, I had many distinct teams reporting to me, including legal, trust and safety, public policy, corporate security, and compliance. I was drawn to work at Twitter because I was inspired by how people were able to use the platform and awed by its potential. Twitter enabled anyone to hear directly from any individual instantly. People from around the world were coming together on Twitter for an open and free exchange of ideas. The work was challenging and fulfilling. After Jack Dorsey returned as CEO in 2015, one of his top priorities became what we called the health of the public conversation. This was based on customer research, advertiser feedback, Twitter's declining revenue, user growth, and stock price. Teams across Twitter were focused on making the platform safer, better, and more profitable. As an executive of the company, I also was responsible for helping to achieve the corporate goals set by Mr. Dorsey, and I was accountable to him, the board of directors, and ultimately Twitter's public stockholders. As we prioritized the health of the public conversation, we did not lose sight of what Twitter was for most people, a place to talk about their favorite things. Topics that animated the platform range from K-pop to the World Cup to video games and movies. We needed to ensure that differences of opinion would not cross the line, for example, into sending death threats to soccer players who miss important goals, distributing non-consensual intimate photos, or cyberbullying so vicious that it could compromise a teenager's mental health. Twitter's platform rules covered a wide range of conduct and changed over time based on new behaviors and harms on the platform and feedback from customers, regulators, governments, advertisers, researchers, and others. This feedback led to a principles-based approach, which we applied to an array of difficult yet equally complicated situations around the world. These rules were also benchmarked against industry standards. We all knew how difficult it would be to design, much less apply, one set of global rules for hundreds of millions of accounts that shared billions of tweets a week. While I was at Twitter, the company never lost sight of its deep commitment to promoting and defending free expression around the world. For example, to protect human rights defenders, we fought for the right of people to use pseudonyms on the platform. We litigated in courts around the world to protect the rights of people to express their opinions, often defending them against their own governments who are acting unlawfully or violating international human rights. And we took extra precautions to ensure we scrutinized or challenged and never just acquiesced to government legal demands. Defending free expression and maintaining the health of the platform required difficult judgment calls. Most applications of Twitter's rules were fact-intensive, subject to internal debate, and needed to be made very quickly. We recognized that after applying our rules, we might learn that some of them did not work as we imagined and that we would need to update them. We always remained open to new information from our customers and critics regarding our policies and enforcement. At times, we also reversed course. For example, on October 14, 2020, the New York Post tweeted articles about Hunter Biden's laptop with embedded images that looked like they may have been obtained through hacking. In 2018, we had developed a policy intended to prevent Twitter from becoming a dumping ground for hacked materials. We applied this policy to the New York Post tweets and blocked links to the articles embedding those source materials. At no point did Twitter otherwise prevent tweeting, reporting, discussing, or describing the contents of Mr. Biden's laptop. People could and did talk about the contents of the laptop on Twitter or anywhere else, including other much larger platforms, but they were prevented from sharing the primary documents on Twitter. Still, over the course of that day, it became clear that Twitter had not fully appreciated the impact of that policy on free press and others. As Mr. Dorsey testified before Congress on multiple occasions, Twitter changed its policy within 24 hours and admitted its initial action was wrong. This policy revision immediately allowed people to tweet the original articles with the embedded source materials. Relying on its long-standing practice not to retroactively apply new policies, Twitter informed the New York Post that it could immediately begin tweeting when it deleted the original tweets, which would have freed them to retweet the same content again. The New York Post chose not to delete its original tweets, so Twitter made an exception after 2 weeks to retroactively apply the new policy to the Post's tweets. In hindsight, Twitter should have reinstated the Post account immediately. There is no easy way to run a global communications platform that satisfies business and revenue goals, individual customer expectations, local laws, and cultural norms, and get it right every time. Still, while I was at Twitter, we worked hard every day to make Twitter a healthy platform and ultimately a healthy business. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roth.
Thank you, Chairman Comer, Ranking Member Raskin, and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak with you here today. In nearly 8 years at Twitter, I worked in and led a division called Trust and Safety. Trust and Safety's core duty is content moderation, removing tweets that violate Twitter's terms of service and suspending users who repeatedly break the rules. This work is sometimes dismissed merely as censorship, but it represents a key way that Twitter and other companies live up to their responsibility to keep the users of their products safe. Much of this work is uncontroversial. For example, taking down accounts that engage in child sexual exploitation or promote terrorism. The gray area of this work, though, is when trust and safety teams have to make decisions about so-called lawful but awful material, content that may be legal in many jurisdictions, but isn't something most people would want to experience. Think of things like posting someone else's home address without their permission, or bullying somebody for a disability or for how they look. A free speech absolutist might say, yes, that kind of content is unpleasant, but it's not against the law. What right do you have to remove it? The answer is the need to make Twitter an appealing product for millions of people. Consistently, in its own research, Twitter found that users were unhappy with the company's approach to content moderation, and that this dissatisfaction drove people away from the service. This has consequences for what we mean by free speech on social media. Again and again, we saw the speech of a small number of abusive users drive away countless others. Unrestricted free speech, paradoxically, results in less speech, not more. And it was our job in trust and safety to try to strike an appropriate balance. But the importance of this work goes far beyond Twitter's business prospects and into the realm of national security. In 2017, I led the team at Twitter that uncovered significant interference in an American election by agents of the Russian government. Their mission was to stoke culture war issues on social media to try to further divide Americans. My team and I exposed hundreds of thousands of these accounts from Russia, but also from Iran, China, and beyond. It's a concern with these foreign interference campaigns that informed Twitter's approach to the Hunter Biden laptop story. In 2020, Twitter noticed activity related to the laptop that, at first glance, bore a lot of similarities to the 2016 Russian hack and leak operation targeting the DNC. And we had to decide what to do. And in that moment, with limited information, Twitter made a mistake. Under the distribution of hacked material policy, the company decided to prevent links to the New York Post stories about the laptop from being shared across the service. I've been clear that in my judgment at the time, Twitter should not have taken action to block the New York Post's reporting. And just 24 hours after doing so, the company acknowledged its error. But the decisions here aren't straightforward, and hindsight is 2020. It isn't obvious what the right response is to a suspected but not confirmed cyber attack by another government on a presidential election. I believe Twitter erred in this case because we wanted to avoid repeating the mistakes of 2016. And so the basic job of trust and safety is to try to strike this balance between the harms of restricting too much speech and the dangers of doing too little. I'll be the first to admit that we didn't always get it right. Even rare mistakes add up when you're carrying out content moderation at the scale of hundreds of millions of unique posts per day. While I was head of trust and safety at Twitter, I strove to do this work with impartiality and with a commitment to the fair enforcement of Twitter's written rules. But whether it's me or Elon Musk or someone else in the future, someone will have to make choices about the governance of online spaces. Those decisions should not be made behind closed doors or based on personal whims. I hope that we can work together to find ways to bring greater trust and transparency to social media, and I look forward to answering the committee's questions about any of these topics to the best of my ability.
Thank you. Ms. Navaroli.
Good morning, Chairman Comer, Ranking Member Raskin, and members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm here because there is an urgent need for us to understand the impact that social media companies are having on our democracy. I will be very clear. I was not involved in the decision around Hunter Biden's laptop, but I was involved in decisions that were made leading up to, during, and after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. If we are going to talk about social media in the government, we need to talk about Twitter's failure to act before January 6th. I am here to tell you that doing nothing is not an option. If we continue to do nothing, violence is going to happen again. My background is as a trained lawyer and journalist, and my expertise over the past decade has been in the areas of media, technology, law, and policy, with a particular focus on social media and free expression. I joined Twitter in 2019, and by 2020, I was the most senior expert on Twitter's US safety policy team. My team's mission was to protect free speech and public safety by writing and enforcing content moderation policies around the world. These policies included things like abuse, harassment, hate speech, violence, and privacy. So if no other algorithm or no other human could decide if a tweet violated my team's policies, the safety team policy acted as the final moderators. If a high-profile individual like any member of this committee or President Trump tweeted something controversial, it was sent to my team's desk. Every day, we had to decide whether a particular piece of content equated to yelling fire in a crowded theater. My work at Twitter and subsequently at Twitch put me in the middle of key events in history. What I've learned from them is that social media played and continues to play a role in these events. And 2 years after January 6th, we still need to better understand the role that Twitter played in order to prevent it from happening again. So what do we need to understand? First, Twitter's leadership bent and broke their own rules in order to protect some of the most dangerous speech on the platform. I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened in the months leading up to January 6th. During this time, my team worked to try to minimize the threat of violence that we saw coming. After President Trump instructed the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by in a debate, we considered the danger that that statement would have if it was tweeted. So we crafted what we called a coded incitement to violence policy to address dog whistles like this. Instead of approving it, management bent over backwards to find ways to not approve it. On January 5th, when the policy was still not approved, I led a meeting where one of my colleagues asked management whether someone was going to have to get shot before we were allowed to take down tweets. Another colleague looked up live tweets and read them to management to try to convince them of the seriousness of the issue. Still, no action was taken. On the morning of January 6th, I sent Twitter lawyers a message warning them that our team was hamstrung by leadership. 2 days later, when it looked like it was going to happen all over again, I asked management whether they wanted more blood on their hands. Only then did they act. The second problem is that there is way too much power concentrated in the hands of too few. With January 6th and many other decisions, content moderators like me did the very best that we could. But far too often, there are far too few of us, and we are being asked to do the impossible. For example, in January 2020, after the U.S. assassinated an Iranian general and the U.S. president decided to justify it on Twitter, management literally instructed me and my team to make sure that World War III did not start on the platform. No person, people, or company should have that kind of unchecked power or that kind of responsibility. The modern-day public conversation should not be susceptible to the whims of any one individual or any one company. Fixing the systemic issues that lead to bad decisions is not going to be easy, but people like me who have been in the trenches can help lead the way. But I must say, coming forward and offering this information is risky and it is difficult. Doxing and harassment are real, and people are afraid to tell what they know. So we need to make sure that there are protections for those who speak the truth. We need to create space to hear from people on the front lines. We need to give them protection so they can share their experiences. Only then can we begin to understand the full scope of the problem and to find solutions. There is far too much at stake for us to do nothing. Thank you.
Thank you all. Excellent opening statements. Now we'll begin with the question portion. We'll begin by recognizing Mr. Biggs for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roth, within just mere minutes or hours after the New York Post published its story on the Hunter Biden laptop, at 8:51 a.m., you sent a message to a team, part of your team, I assume, and you said it isn't clearly violative of our hacked materials policy, referring to the story, nor is it clearly in violation of anything else. Do you remember sending that message?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I don't recall that message specifically, but that does sound like my judgment on that day, yes.
Okay, so that was early on in the day, and yet shortly thereafter, Kayleigh McEnany, White House press secretary's, her account was locked. So an inquiry was made the next day by a person named Carolyn Strom. You know Carolyn Strom?
Yes, sir, I do.
Yeah, Carolyn Strom asked what's going on here, and somebody named Elaine Ong Soto said the user was bounced by site integrity for violating our hacked materials policy. Do you remember that incident?
Yes, sir, I do.
And somebody named Trenton Kennedy said, I'm struggling to understand the policy basis for marking this as unsafe. And I think the best explainability argument, now that may be a technical term for you, but for me it looks like we're trying to create a narrative here to cover our butt. The best explainability argument for this externally will be that we're waiting to understand if this story is the result of hacked materials. Do you remember Mr. Kennedy's communication?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. And so then we get into a whole series of things written by Mr. Baker going back and forth. And he says on that same day, now at 9:26, which is about a half an hour after your statement that you don't think that anything's been violated here, he says, I've seen some reliable cybersecurity folks question the authenticity of the emails in another way. And then you seem to later, but by the way, that's almost inconceivable. I mean, it just seems inconceivable that would have happened so quickly that he would have that. And then you sent out something right after that said, the key factor informing our approach is consensus from experts monitoring election security and disinformation that this looks a lot like a hack and leak that learned from the 2016 WikiLeaks approach. I'm wondering if you can name for me today any of the experts that seem to have a consensus at 10:12 a.m. on the morning of October 14th that you put out saying that we're going to rely on some group of experts. Who were they?
Thank you for the question. Twitter did not give me access to any of my documents or emails to prepare for this hearing, and so unfortunately I can't give you a direct answer.
Were there, Mr. Roth, were there experts? Were there people that you consulted that were cybersecurity experts between 9 a.m. and 10:15 a.m. on that day?
My recollection is that we were following discussions about this incident as they unfolded on Twitter. So cybersecurity experts were tweeting about this incident and sharing their perspectives, and that informed some of Twitter's judgment here. But I want to emphasize, as I said in my statement, I didn't think that the evidence or those perspectives warranted removal, and I advocated against taking that action.
I understand. Let's look at one other document. Our teams made the determination that the materials fall under our hacked materials policy. It's my understanding from reports and internal sources that normally a hacked material policy would require a government official or law enforcement determination that there had actually been a hacked account before that hacked policy were to be imposed. Is that accurate?
No, sir, it's not.
So the policy did not require that there be any kind of official finding by a government source?
No, there were a number of different types of evidence that we considered under the policy. Certainly government attribution would be a powerful one, but we also looked.
So you weren't looking, that wasn't determinative is what we're saying?
In that instance, we did not have any specific information from any government source, no.
I'm going to read something that applies to this and several other things from the Twitter stack that you guys had. This might be an unpopular opinion, but one-off ad hoc decisions like this that don't appear rooted in policy are, in my humble opinion, a slippery slope and reflect an alternatively equally dictatorial problem. Quite frankly, that's what the essence of all four of your testimony. I realize you're trying to fight against it, but you exercised an amazing amount of clout and power over the entire American electorate by even holding them hostage for 24 hours, reversing your policy, and then they're like, well, we want to go back with the originals. That's 24 hours, or 2 weeks, that you imposed your will on the American electorate. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time's expired. He went 30 seconds over. I'll give the ranking member an extra 30 seconds.
You're very fair-minded, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ross, let me start with you. Did I hear you correctly to say that there were thousands or even hundreds of thousands of counterfeit Twitter accounts set up by Russian propaganda and disinformation for Vladimir Putin to pump his poison into the bloodstream of American social media? Is that right?
That's right, sir. And that's not just past tense. Those accounts are active on social media today. This is an ongoing campaign.
Well, we should be having a hearing about that. I appreciate your alerting to us what's taken place. Ms. Navaroli, so you've testified that in the months leading up to the November 2020 election, and then in the weeks before January 6th, you were growing increasingly anxious about the violent rhetoric and incitement that you saw posted on Twitter. Can you describe specifically what made you so concerned during that period? And did you raise your concerns with people at Twitter?
Thank you for that question. As I said in my opening statement, after former President Trump in his debate said the statement, stand back, stand by to the Proud Boys, my team, in discussion with other teams at Twitter, realized that we had a gap in our policies and that that could not be said on the platform because it would have gone too far. What we did see continue to happen was those statements, in addition to other coded incitement to violence or dog whistles, began to spring up on the platform. And so what was once fringe ideology or fringe statements that were calling for the overthrow of the government became a loud roar. And so we heard individuals beginning to say that they were locked and loaded, that they were ready for Civil War Part 2, that they were ready for another revolution, that they were ready for the day of the rope, in very clear English on Twitter.
And on the January 6th committee, we have tens of thousands of statements like that being made on Twitter and other parts of social media. So we got a little taste of what you were experiencing on a daily basis. Now, there was this meeting on January 5th at Twitter. I don't think it was called specifically to look at what was going to happen the next day. That just happened to be a regular meeting. But at that meeting, you and other employees raised urgently the problem of what you saw coming on January 6th. How did Twitter management respond to the concerns that you raised?
That's a great question. And yes, that meeting was a regularly scheduled meeting. Within the meeting, I believe I referred to it in my testimony to the January 6th committee as I was at my wit's end. I had argued, I had asked questions, I had asked for clarification. We had found dangerous tweets within the meeting, and yet the individual who is the most senior leader within the team in that meeting told us that we were not allowed to take that content down and that we were not allowed to use the coded incitement to violence policy. The reason that she gave us mirrored what we had been told by the former head of Trust and Safety, Del Harvey, that individuals might be saying things like locked and loaded or stand back and stand by in ways of self-protection. That was not what we were seeing on the platform.
So when you were seeing things like locked and loaded and Civil War Part 2 and race war and so on, were you warning your superiors at Twitter that you thought there was going to be real violence, that this was not hyperbole that was being spoken at that point?
Absolutely. I specifically told Del Harvey herself that someone was going to get shot, as I testified to to the January 6th committee.
You stated that Donald Trump described his own tweets as little missiles. Why did that stick in your mind?
Yes, the quote that you're referring to, I don't remember exactly what news article that it was in, but it was a news article that I had read in which the former president said that he liked to send out his tweets like little missiles. To me, that sounded exactly like weaponization of a platform, in his own words, and yet Twitter was not concerned.
All right. Well, again, this bears a complete hearing on its own. This is a real issue, unlike something that happened a couple of years ago for 24 hours that has already disappeared in the sands of time. But this is facing us today. As you say, those right-wing violent forces are still out there, and the social media can still be used as a channel for incitement to violent action against state legislatures, school boards, the Capitol of the United States, Congress, and so on. How do we prevent this from happening in the future, and do you think that Twitter is dealing with this problem effectively now?
As I said in my opening statement, we have to do something. There is too much at stake for us to continue to do nothing. And this question of how do we prevent it is a big one. Unfortunately, I do not believe that we are at a place that we can come to solutions because we do not know how these companies work. We must continue to hear from individuals like myself. We must have a seat at the table to be able to share our experiences, because our experiences and the ways that we have succeeded, the ways that we have failed, hold the key to our futures and the key to our democracies.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just say I was skeptical about revisiting the whole New York Post thing, where there have already been congressional hearings and they've already apologized for their little lapse, but this is a serious issue, and so I'm glad we at least have the opportunity to begin to talk about it in public. And I yield back to you. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I'll recognize myself now for questioning. The Biden family investigation begins with the story of how big tech, the media, former intelligence agents, and the Bidens themselves suppressed the story of Hunter Biden's laptop weeks before the 2020 election. Today, we're hearing from Twitter executives who buried the New York Post laptop story, claiming it violated the platform's hacked materials policy. In reality, the Twitter executives were hostile towards conservatives and biased towards anyone who opposed their points of view. For example, Mr. Roth, did you write this tweet?
I regret the language that I used in some of my former tweets, but yes, I did post that.
And I'll read the tweet so it's in the record. Yes, that person in the pink hat is clearly a bigger threat to your brand of feminism than actual Nazis in the White House. Mr. Roth, do you think all conservatives are Nazis?
Certainly not, sir.
What about the hundreds of people who worked in the Trump administration?
Certainly not.
Did Ms. Gaddy or any other lawyer at Twitter ever tell you to take down that tweet?
No, Twitter did not have a practice of restricting employees sharing their personal viewpoints on the service.
Okay. Turning back to the laptop, Ms. Gaddy, are you aware that Hunter Biden's lawyers, as recently as last week, wrote the Department of Justice about Hunter Biden's laptop?
I've seen some articles about that.
Yes, they did. And it appears that Hunter Biden's attorney is admitting that the laptop and emails on it are authentic. So, Ms. Gaddy, on October 14, 2020, did Hunter Biden report to Twitter that he was the victim of a hack?
No, I don't believe he did.
Ms. Gaddy, when the New York Post initially broke the story about the laptop, did you call Hunter Biden's lawyer to ask if it was authentic?
No, I did not.
Isn't it correct that the Biden campaign had contact with Twitter in the run-up to the 2020 election?
Not to my knowledge.
And you're telling this committee that you didn't ask any Biden representative if the laptop was real or for Hunter Biden's attorney's phone number to confirm its authenticity?
We did not speak to anybody related to that.
Mr. Baker, are you aware that the FBI had Hunter Biden's laptop since December of 2019?
I'm sorry, am I aware of that now?
Well, were you aware then?
Then, no, I don't believe, sir, that to the best of my recollection, I don't think I knew
But
that.
you're aware now?
I've heard that now, yes.
Mr. Baker, did you call any of your contacts at the FBI to ask whether or not they knew if the material had been hacked?
I don't recall contacting them about that on that day.
Mr. Roth, Ms. Gaddy, and Mr. Baker, it appears to me that you failed at your jobs. You were entrusted with the highest level of power at Twitter, but when you were faced with the New York Post story, instead of allowing people to judge the information for themselves, you rushed to find a reason why the American people shouldn't see it. In a matter of hours, you were deciding on the truth of a story that spans years and dozens of complex international transactions. You did this because you were terrified of Joe Biden not winning the election in 2020. That's what it appeared. I can assure you this committee will succeed in holding the Bidens accountable. So much of the evidence of wrongdoing from this family is located in that hard drive that you all led the American people to believe was Russian disinformation, when in fact it was not. Now, I agree with Mr. Baker's opening statement. The concern for me is the level of involvement the FBI had with not just Twitter, but all of our social media platform companies. And I think it kind of goes in the opposite direction of where my friend, the ranking member, was trying to take this in his opening statement. This is something this committee should be concerned about. The government doesn't have any role in suppressing speech. And that's something the media should be very concerned about. What if there's a conservative president that somehow cleans out our FBI and they put in conservatives to suppress liberal speech? We don't, that's something that should never happen. So I look forward to more questions, and at this time I yield to the gentleman from
I thank
Ohio.
the chair for yielding. Mr. Baker, you said you didn't talk with the FBI that day. Did you talk to the FBI about the Hunter Biden laptop story prior to then or after that day?
I'm trying to make sure I can answer this question consistent with the restrictions that I talked about in my opening
Simple
statement.
question. Did you
Yeah.
talk to the FBI about the Hunter Biden story?
I do, to the best of my recollection, I did not talk to the FBI about the Hunter Biden story before that day.
Did you talk to him after it? You said your
recall.
response is real specific to the chairman. You said, I did not talk to the FBI about the Hunter Biden laptop story that day. I assume that day is October 14th. I want to know if you talked to him on the 13th or before, or if you talked to him on the 15th and after.
I don't recall speaking to the FBI, sitting here today, I don't recall speaking to the FBI at all about the Hunter Biden matter.
Well, then why'd you answer it the way you did?
I beg your pardon?
I yield back there.
Chair recognizes Ms. Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like Benghazi before, Republicans are on a taxpayer-funded expedition to attack their political rivals, and they're feeding the flames of conspiracy in the process. With the release of the so-called Twitter files, Donald Trump has seized the moment to further his own conspiracies about the 2020 election, writing in December, and I quote, "Do not throw the presidential election results of 2020 out and declare, do you throw the presidential election results of 2020 out and declare the rightful winner, or do you have a new election?" A massive fraud of this type and magnitude allows for the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, and even those found in the Constitution, end quote. Now, it bears repeating that this is the same man who incited an insurrection on January 6th, and just last week reposted a message on Truth Social that suggested his supporters will, quote, and I'm quoting him now, physically fight for him this time, and added, "They got my 6 and we are loaded, and I mean loaded." This is a question for Ms. Navarrete. What did the phrase locked and loaded mean to you while you were at Twitter prior to January 6th?
Yes, thank you for that question. The way that I read locked and loaded to be interpreted by the tweets that I saw coming on Twitter prior to January 6th was that individuals were loaded, were armed, and that they were ready to commit violence.
Are you concerned that the use of this language will continue to incite and legitimize political violence leading to the next election?
Absolutely. We are sitting exactly 1 month in which the exact same playbook was played in Brazil, and we saw almost deja vu happening again. As I said in my opening statement, unless we do something, this will continue to happen again.
Thank you, Ms. Navarrete. Mr. Roth, you are no stranger to conspiracies and their real-world consequences. If you don't mind, can you please describe for the committee how the release of the so-called Twitter files has affected your personal safety?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. The Twitter files, I would note first and foremost, didn't just affect me, but affected much more junior employees at Twitter. Employees as far away as Manila in the Philippines were doxxed, had their families threatened, and experienced harm equal to or greater than what I've experienced. But concurrent with the Twitter files, Elon Musk also made the decision to share a defamatory allegation that I support or condone pedophilia. And this lie led directly to a wave of homophobic and anti-Semitic threats and harassment against me, of which Twitter has removed vanishingly little. And following the Daily Mail's decision to publish where I live, ultimately I had to leave my home and sell it. Those are the consequences for this type of online harassment and speech.
Well, I must say, those are very real consequences. By legitimizing unsubstantiated conspiracy theories about the deep state, big tech, and government censorship for political gain, committee Republicans are holding a match to a powder keg. We all saw the consequences of this kind of rhetoric on January 6th, and we continue to see it play out as political violence and hate crimes grip communities around the country. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Lady yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Mace for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Twitter files were not just about Hunter Biden's laptop. Twitter files make it apparent Twitter worked overtime to suppress accurate COVID information. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is a professor of medicine at Stanford who once tweeted an article he wrote about natural immunity. Thanks to Elon Musk's release of the Twitter files, we learned some of his tweets were tagged with the label of Trends Blacklist. Apparently, the views of a Stanford doctor are disinformation to you people. I, along with many Americans, have long-term effects from COVID. Not only was I a long hauler, but I have effects from the vaccine. It wasn't the first shot, but it was the second shot that I now developed asthma that has never gone away since I had the second shot. I have tremors in my left hand, and I have the occasional heart pain that no doctor can explain, and I've had a battery of tests. I find it extremely alarming Twitter's unfettered censorship spread into medical fields and affected millions of Americans by suppressing expert opinions from doctors and censoring those who disagree with the CDC. I have great regrets about getting the shot because of the health issues that I now have that I don't think are ever going to go away. And I know that I'm not the only American who has those kinds of concerns. Another example of what Twitter has done to censor folks is from Dr. Martin Koldorf, a Harvard-educated epidemiologist, who once tweeted, "COVID vaccines are important for high-risk people and their caretakers. Those with prior natural infection do not need it, nor children." The Twitter files reveal this tweet was deemed false information because it ran contrary to the CDC. So my first question this morning of Ms. Gaddy, may I ask of you, where did you go to medical school?
I did not go to medical school.
I'm sorry?
I did not go to medical school.
That's what I thought. Why do you think you or anyone else at Twitter had the medical expertise to censor a doctor's expert opinion?
Our policies regarding COVID were designed to protect individuals. We were seeing
You guys censored Harvard-educated doctors, Stanford-educated doctors, doctors that are educated in the best places in the world, and you silenced those voices. My next question is, did the U.S. government, I have another chart I want to show you, Ms. Gaddy. I have another tweet by someone with a following of a full 18,000 followers. This person put a chart from the CDC on Twitter. It's the CDC's own data, so it's accurate by your standards, and you all labeled this as misleading. You're not a doctor, right, Ms. Gaddy?
No, I'm not.
Okay. What makes you think you or anyone else at Twitter have the medical expertise to censor actual, accurate CDC data?
I'm not familiar with these particular situations.
Yeah, I'm sure you're not. But this is what Twitter did. They labeled this as inaccurate. It is the government's own data. It's ridiculous that we're even having to have this conversation today. It's not just about the laptop. This is about medical advice that expert doctors were trying to give Americans because social media companies like Twitter were silencing their voices. I have another question, my last one for you, Ms. Gaddy. Did the U.S. government ever contact you or anyone at Twitter to pressure Twitter to moderate or censor certain tweets? Yes or no?
We have a program.
Did the U.S. government ever contact you or anyone at Twitter to censor or moderate certain tweets? Yes or no?
We receive legal demands to remove content from the platform from the U.S. government and governments all around the world. Those are published on a third-party website, and anyone can review
Thank
them.
God for Matt Taibbi. Thank God for Elon Musk for allowing to show us in the world that Twitter was basically a subsidiary of the FBI, censoring real medical voices with real expertise that put real Americans' lives in danger because they didn't have that information. I also want to thank one of my colleagues, Ro Khanna, because as it turns out, censorship isn't just an important issue to conservatives. Some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, like Ro, found this censorship very concerning, and even wrote to you and to folks at Twitter that he was concerned about the First Amendment being censored. So I want to thank him for speaking up and speaking out about this issue, because this should not be a partisan issue. This should be an issue that's an American issue. Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter into the record, I ask unanimous consent, to enter into the record a Wall Street Journal article from December 9th, 2022 by Justin Hart entitled "The Twitter Blacklisting of Jay Bhattacharya." Enter the record, please, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to go over the chronology here, Mr. Roth. Back in 2016, Russia and Vladimir Putin engaged in what bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee investigators called a, and I quote, aggressive, multifaceted effort to influence the outcome of that year's presidential election. The campaign included hacking of the systems of a major political party and leaking illegally obtained information, scanning U.S. election systems for vulnerabilities, and exploiting the weaknesses of social media platforms to spread disinformation to the American people. Again, in a 2017 declassified report, the U.S. intelligence community assessed that Russia's 2016 election operations signaled a, quote, new normal in Russian influence efforts, and that the Kremlin would, quote, apply lessons learned going forward against the U.S. and its allies. Mr. Roth, in a December interview with journalist Kara Swisher, you state that this declassified assessment was, quote, and I'm quoting you, a watershed moment in the history of content moderation and the Internet, close quote. You also stated in that interview that Twitter discussed potential threats to the integrity of the 2020 elections, and it was, quote, and I'm quoting you again, obvious to think about the most influential thing that impacted the 2016 election, which was the hack and leak campaign organized by the Russian government, and that, quote, we would have been stupid not to think about that risk. Mr. Roth, why would Twitter have been stupid to ignore that risk?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think Twitter and the entire social media industry were, frankly, caught with their pants down in 2016 and missed an opportunity to do the critical work of protecting election security. This isn't my judgment. This is the judgment of academics and researchers who have spent years studying Russian active measures. And most of their conclusions suggest that the #1 most influential part of the Russian active measures campaign in 2016 was the hack and leak targeting John Podesta. It would have been foolish not to consider the possibility that they would run that play again.
Right. And so let me ask, was that top of mind for Twitter? You're trying to measure the credibility of incoming intelligence. Was that top of mind in regard to your decision, the company's decision to temporarily limit the distribution of the October 14th New York Post story that was delivered by Mayor Giuliani?
Yes, that was one of the animating concerns for us. For nearly 2 years, we had engaged in scenario planning exercises for potential risks tied to the elections, and one of them appeared to be happening that day. Now, again, I think the facts were complicated, and I do believe Twitter made a mistake then, but our judgment was colored by the experience of 2016 and by the very real Russian activities that we saw play out that year.
Mr. Roth, in a December 2020 sworn declaration to the FEC, you said that starting in 2018, you had, quote, regular meetings with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and industry peers regarding election security. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, it is.
You stated that during these meetings, quote, federal law enforcement agencies communicated that they expected hack and leak operations by state actors that might occur in the period shortly before the 2020 presidential election, likely in October, and that there were, quote, rumors that a hack and leak operation would involve Hunter Biden, close quote. Is that your recollection today?
It is, but I want to clarify that sentence slightly. I think it actually should have been two separate sentences. It is true that in meetings between industry and law enforcement discussed the possibility of a hack and leak campaign in the lead up to the election. And in one of those meetings, it was discussed, I believe by another company, that there was a possibility that that hack and leak could relate to Hunter Biden and Burisma. I don't believe that perspective was shared by law enforcement. They didn't endorse it. They didn't provide that information in that meeting.
Okay. Just to fast forward here, and in fact, in March 2021, 4 months after the election, the U.S. intelligence community assessed that Russian President Putin authorized a range of government organizations conducted influence operations aimed at denigrated President Biden's candidacy and the Democratic Party, supporting former President Trump and undermining public confidence in the electoral process and exacerbating socio-political divisions in the U.S. that obviously reared their head on January 6th. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Jordan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roth, did the government tell you that the Biden laptop story was fake?
No, sir, they did not.
Did they tell you it was hacked?
No, sir, they did not.
On October 14, 2020, Twitter blocks the New York Post story on the Hunter Biden, the New York Post story on Hunter Biden, and suspends their account. The night before, FBI Special Agent Elvis Chan sends you an email. The email says this: heads up, I will be sending a teleporter link for you to download 10 documents. It's not spam. Please confirm receipt when you get it. 2 minutes later, 6:24 p.m., you respond back, received and downloaded, thanks. What were those 10 documents?
Twitter didn't give me access to my laptop, but Special Agent Chan has said publicly, and the FBI has confirmed, that those documents did not relate to Hunter Biden, and that's my recollection of them.
What did they relate to?
My interactions with Agent Chan and with the FBI almost entirely focused on what the FBI called malign foreign interference, things like Russian troll farms and Iranian involvement in the elections, not on any type of domestic
Any of the
activity.
information on there classified?
No, sir, I do not hold a security clearance, and so I would not have received any classified information.
Who does hold a security clearance? I'll just go to the second email here. I'm just curious about this. What I propose is that 30 days out from the election, this is another email to you from Mr. Chan. 30 days, we get temporary clearances. You pick who they are. Who were the people at Twitter who had a security clearance?
To be honest, sir, I'm not sure, and we never ultimately followed through on this plan to get temporary clearances.
Did anyone at Twitter have a security clearance?
It's my understanding that at least some current or former employees did hold clearances, but I wasn't certain about that.
Ms. Gaddy, do you know if anyone took up Mr. Chan's offer to hand out security clearances 30 days before the 2020 election?
Not that I'm aware.
So we don't know how many people had security clearances. Twitter, do we know? Mr. Baker, Mr. Gaddy, Ms. Gaddy, anyone know how many people at Twitter had a security clearance in the 30 days prior to the election?
I don't know the answer to that question,
Ms.
sir.
Gaddy?
I do not know.
Mr. Roth, you don't know?
No, sir.
Well, how about the last one? Ms. Navaroli, do you know?
No.
I mean, it seemed like the offer was to sort of just hand them out like candy. I just wondered who had them. No one knows? Okay. So the FBI didn't tell you that it was fake, didn't tell you that it was hacked. And Mr. Roth, did the story violate your policies?
In my judgment at the time, no, it did not.
Yeah, that's what you said. Said what I would propose, is you said, it isn't clearly a violation of our hack materials policy, nor is it clearly a violation of anything else. So I think what a lot of people are wondering is, if it didn't violate your policies, and they didn't tell you it was fake, didn't tell you it was hacked, why'd you take it down?
The company made a decision that found that it did violate the policy. It wasn't my personal judgment at the time that it did, but the decision was communicated to me by my direct supervisor, and ultimately, I didn't disagree with it enough to object to
You know what I think happened, Mr. Roth? I think you guys got played. I think you guys wanted to take it deep down. We saw what the chairman put up where you said, you know, everyone in the White House is a fascist. I think you guys wanted it to be taken down. I think you meet with these guys every week. We know that's been established in the Twitter files. You had weekly meetings with Mr. Chan in the run-up to the election. They send you all kinds of emails. They send you documents on the super secret James Bond teleporter. You get information on that. I think you guys wanted to take it down. I think you guys got played by the FBI. And that's the scary part. Because we had 50, I mean, this to me is the real takeaway. 51 former intelligence officials 5 days after you guys take down the Hunter Biden story and block the New York Post account. 5 days later, 51 former intel officials send a letter and they say, the Hunter Biden story has all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. The information operation was run on you guys, and then by extension run on the American people. And that's the concern. And to Mr. Raskin's point that you guys aren't bound by the First Amendment because you're a private company, okay, maybe so, but your terms of service don't have to comply with the First Amendment. Would that be right, Mr. Roth? They don't have to. You've said that as much in your testimony.
My understanding of the First Amendment is that it protects people and businesses from government, not
Understand
informs how the...
in your terms of service. So here's what I want to know. Here's what I want to know. Is this a violation of the First Amendment when the government, Mr. Chan, again, sending you an email saying, we think these accounts need to be looked at because they violate your terms of service? That's a different standard. So you got the government saying your terms of service, which don't have to comply with the First Amendment, but the government saying we don't think these accounts comply with your terms of service, please take them down. You see a problem there, Mr. Roth?
Mr. Chairman, I'm seeing a flashing red light. I'm happy to answer the question. Do I think that that's a valuable use of the FBI's time? No, but I don't see in a request for review a problem under the First Amendment, no.
I sure do. I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Conley for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good.
My, what happens when you hold a hearing and you can't prove your point? We heard from the chairman in his opening statement that it's wrong for government to call Twitter and say, take down a tweet. Did I hear that correct, Mr. Roth?
That was my understanding, yes.
Yeah. So on May 27th, 2020, President Donald J. Trump tweeted, and I quote, Republicans feel that social media platforms totally silence conservatives. By the way, something that would come as news to you, apparently, Mr. Roth, because you're still the subject of conservative harassment. We will strongly regulate, he went on to say, or close them down before we ever allow this to happen, unquote. Ms. Navaroli, doesn't that sound eerily like a government official telling Twitter that there's a threat, we'll shut you down if we don't like the content?
I am not familiar with the tweet that you have referenced.
Well, but if I just told you that quote without telling you who said it, might it have some ominous overtones from your point of view if you're still at Twitter? We'll shut you down. We'll regulate you. We will never allow this to happen. Those are pretty strong words.
They are.
Yeah. Okay. On September 8th, 2019, at 11:11 p.m., Donald Trump heckled two celebrities on Twitter, John Legend and his wife, Chrissy Teigen, and referred to them as the musician John Legend and his filthy-mouthed wife, unquote. Ms. Teigen responded to that email at 12:17 a.m., and according to notes from a conversation with you, Ms. Navaroli's counsel, your counsel, the White House almost immediately thereafter contacted Twitter to demand the tweet be taken down. Is that accurate?
Thank you for the question. In my role, I was not responsible for receiving any sort of request from the government. However, what I was privy to was my supervisors letting us know that we had received something along those lines or something of a request. In that particular instance, I do remember hearing that we had received a request from the White House to make sure that we evaluated this tweet and that they wanted it to come down because it was a derogatory statement directed towards the president.
They wanted it to come down. They made that request.
To my recollection, yes.
I thought that was an inappropriate action by a government official, let alone the White House. But it wasn't Joe Biden about his son's laptop. It was Donald Trump because he didn't like what Chrissy Teigen had to say about him. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
My. You ever think it's appropriate for the President of the United States to direct or otherwise influence a social media company to take down its content?
I think it's a very slippery slope.
Mr. Roth, Ms. Gaddy, Mr. Baker, any evidence that Joe Biden's ever done that?
Certainly none that I'm aware of, no.
I don't recall anything like that.
I'm sorry, that President Biden did what, sir?
Has Joe Biden ever called Twitter, to your knowledge, or his White House at his behest to take down content or urge you to take down content?
I don't know the answer to that question, sir.
Well, I'm going to have to conclude at least from 3 of the 4, you don't know. There's no evidence he's ever done that, but there's plenty of evidence Donald J. Trump tried to do that. And if we're going to have a hearing about the misuse of social media and the intrusion of government in the content on social media, we've got an environment-rich target, but it's not Joe Biden. It's Donald J. Trump, and of course, we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about Russian bots and Russian fabrications using fake accounts on Twitter to a political purpose, and it's not to help elect Democrats. And we don't want to talk about 4 years of Donald Trump manipulating the truth and trying to manipulate social media and threaten it, or directly to try to shape it by taking down content because it was critical of him personally. And that's what we ought to be talking about as we move forward, not the subject of today's hearing. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Donalds for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quick, Mr. Roth, you've stated already that what happened with the New York Post story was similar to the hack and leak scenarios from 2016. You also said that you actually were opposed to deleting the New York Post story. Who advocated for the removal of the New York Post story?
The company's decision to treat it as a violation.
Mr. Roth, who at the company actually went over your recommendation? Because you're pretty high up. Who overrode you?
The decision was communicated to me by my direct supervisor.
Who was that person?
Her name was Del Harvey. She was
Okay.
the vice president of trust and safety at the time.
All right, thank you so much. Ms. Gaddy, real quick, you said to the chairman earlier, and I want to paraphrase what I heard earlier, is that Twitter had no contact with anybody from the Biden team. Is that correct to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge.
Put that up for me. Okay, over my right shoulder, we have an email. Reference, this is Saturday, October 24th, 5:39 p.m., referencing 5 different tweets. This is with a Twitter email chain. Under the line, it's more to review from the Biden team. Does anybody have a comment on how much interaction was happening with the Biden team at Twitter with respect to tweets that they wanted Twitter to review? Ms. Gaddy, Mr. Roth?
I'm not familiar with this email.
So you're not familiar with this email, Mr. Roth? Are you familiar with this email?
Only from what's been reported in the Twitter files.
Did you ever have contact with anybody from the Biden team?
No, sir, I did not. We explicitly separated the teams that would interact with campaigns from teams like mine that were responsible for content moderation.
How big was the organization in Twitter that was actually working with campaigns?
I couldn't say for sure.
Did you ever have any contact with the DNC?
Directly? No, I did not.
Did anybody at Twitter have any contact with anybody at the DNC?
I think it's likely that somebody at Twitter did, yes.
In these emails, it's listed these are tweets that had to be flagged from the Biden team. That's what's in the files. You have no idea how many people actually engaged with the Twitter team or how frequently that engagement happened.
No, and again, that was by design. We kept those functions separate from content moderation so that we could impartially assess reports like this.
Do you know how many tweets were actually flagged and taken down at the behest of the Biden team?
I wouldn't agree with the characterization of it as being at the behest of them. These tweets were reported, and Twitter independently evaluated them under its rules.
But the email is very clear. More to review from Biden team. The response 3 hours later at the bottom, hold this up real quick so we can see. The request at the bottom, it says, handled these. What does handled these mean?
My understanding is that these tweets contained non-consensual nude photos of Hunter Biden, and they were removed by the company under.
Hold on, real quick, Mr. Roth. How could you know so much about the content of these tweets? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, these are just web addresses. I don't know what's in these tweets. You have these things committed to memory that you know the content, but you don't know who you talk to at the Biden team?
Sir, I didn't meet with the Biden team, but there was extensive public reporting about these tweets specifically that uncovered what they were.
You know the contents of the tweets. It was obviously at Twitter, but you have no idea how often people who worked in your organization had with the Biden team during the end of the 2020 presidential elections.
I would emphasize that the people who interfaced with the campaigns were not part of my team or organization. I would know what the interactions were if they were on my team. It was a different part of the organization, not mine.
Let me ask you a separate question, and I'll ask it of you too, Mr. Baker. Have you guys been able to quantify the amount of in-kind contributions associated with taking down the New York Post story? Because the New York Post story was down for 2 weeks, give or take. Do you have any understanding of how much that story was limited by Twitter and also by other social media companies? What the impact of an in-kind contribution that would be to the Joe Biden presidential election in 2020?
I don't know the answer to that question, sir.
Do you think it's big?
I don't know the answer.
Do you think it's more than a maximum contribution to a campaign?
I wouldn't want to speculate.
Would you call it 25,000?
I don't know the answer to that question.
100,000?
Sir, I don't know the answer to the question.
$1 million?
I don't know the answer to the question.
Do you think Twitter will be in violation of federal election laws with the size of an in-kind contribution to take down a story, which is true, by the way, because you guys thought you knew something with limited information?
I'm not going to speculate on that sitting here today, sir. I try to propound a legal analysis of election laws.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. It's your turn. You want to go? Okay. We won't start the clock till you get there.
Appreciate also your generosity. I just want to start off right here at the top here. This isn't even my line of questioning, but I'd like to submit to the record a Washington Post article now warning about Hunter Biden laptop disinformation, the guy who leaked it. Here's the deal. Before I even get into my questions, I think that the story here with the Washington Post reporting is that what they're saying right here, when the New York Post first reported in October 2020 that it had obtained contents of a laptop computer allegedly owned by Joe Biden's son Hunter, there was an immediate roadblock faced by other news outlets that hoped to corroborate reporting, as many did. The newspaper wasn't sharing what it obtained. New York Post had this alleged information and was trying to publish it without any corroboration, without any backup information. They were trying to publish it to Twitter. Twitter did not let them, and now they were upset. I believe that political operatives who sought to inject explosive disinformation with the Washington Post couldn't get away with it. And now they're livid. And they want the ability to do that again. They want the ability to inject this again. So they've dragged a social media platform here in Congress. They're weaponizing the use of this committee so that they can do it again. A whole hearing about a 24-hour hiccup in a right-wing political operation. That is why we are here right now. And it's just an abuse of public resources, an abuse of public time. We could be talking about health care. We could be talking about bringing down the cost of prescription drugs. We could be talking about abortion rights, civil rights, voting rights. But instead, we're talking about Hunter Biden's half-fake laptop story. I mean, this is an embarrassment. But I'll go into it. Ms. Navarrete, let's talk about something real. I'd like to show you a tweet posted by former President Trump about my colleagues and I on July 14, 2019. It says in part, quote, "Why don't they go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came? Then come back and show us how it's done. These places need your help badly. You can't leave fast enough. I'm sure that Nancy Pelosi would be very happy as quickly to work out free travel arrangements." A day or two after that, Donald Trump publicly incited, violence at a rally, targeting 4 congresswomen, including myself, saying, "Go back to where you came from." Ms. Navaroli, as I understand it, you were the most senior member of Twitter's content moderation team, or a senior member of Twitter's content moderation team when this was posted. As part of your responsibilities, did you review this tweet?
Yes, it was my team's responsibility to review these tweets.
And what did you conclude?
My team, Ray, made the recommendation that for the first time we find Donald Trump in violation of Twitter's policies and use the public interest interstitial.
For the first time?
Yes.
And at the time, Twitter's policy included a specific example when it came to banned abuse against immigrants, as they specifically included the phrase, "go back to your country," or go back to where you came from, correct?
Yes, that was specifically included in the content moderation guidance as an example.
You brought this up to the Vice President of Trust and Safety, Del Harvey, correct?
I did, yes.
And she overrode your assessment, didn't she?
Yes, she did.
And something interesting happened after she overrode your assessment. A day or two later, Twitter seemed to have changed their policies, didn't they?
Yes, that trope, "go back to where you came from," was removed from the content moderation guidance as an example.
So Twitter changed their own policy after the president violated it in order to potentially accommodate his tweet?
Yes.
Thank you. So much for bias against right wing on Twitter. Additionally, Ms. Navaroli, are you familiar with the account Libs of TikTok?
I have heard of it from the news, yes.
Mr. Roth, are you familiar with this account?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
Are you aware that from August 11th to August 16th, that account posted false information about Boston Children's Hospital, claiming that they were providing hysterectomies to children?
Yes, I am aware of that and other claims from the account.
And are you aware that this lie was then circulated by other prominent far-right influencers?
Yes.
And are you aware that all these claims, which I have reiterated were false, culminated in a real-life harassment and ultimately a bomb threat to the Boston Children's Hospital?
Yes, I am aware.
And this account is still on that platform today, isn't it?
Regrettably, yes, it is.
Despite inspiring a bomb threat due to the right-wing incitement of violence against trans Americans in this country, because they cannot let go of this obsession with fixating violence and inciting violence against trans and LGBT people, in addition to immigrants, in addition to women of color. This is a party that cannot pick on anyone their own size. And they are trying to co-opt an entire social media platform and use the power of this committee and of Congress in order to pursue a political agenda. I yield back.
Lady yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Fry for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing shows who really has been in control of what is said to be one of the world's most widely used websites, Twitter. The American people probably didn't know who these witnesses were today, but these witnesses were powerful enough to silence an American president with just a few clicks from their California office. We're also learning that some of those in Washington, D.C. have forgotten their role and exercised their power to achieve ends antithetical to American principles of free speech and expression. The FBI is the lead federal agency responsible for investigating foreign influence operations. However, in recent years, the FBI has devoted countless amounts of time, taxpayer money, and manpower to combating Russian foreign influence on social media. The FBI, as one reporter noted, acted as a, quote, doorman to the vast program of social media surveillance and censorship encompassing agencies across the federal government, from the State Department to the Pentagon to the CIA. End quote. Reports suggest that thousands of reports from the FBI and the Foreign Influence Task Force were sent to Twitter. This isn't what the American people are paying for. This isn't what we trust the FBI to do. FBI agents shouldn't be sitting at a desk in Washington, D.C., scrolling through Twitter and emailing with social media companies. An email from one Twitter employee to another reads, quote, "The FBI San Francisco Emergency Operations Center sent us the attached report of 207 tweets they believed may be in violation of our policies," end quote. Another email revealed that there are, quote, "some folks in the Baltimore field office and at headquarters that are just doing keyboard searches for violations." Mr. Roth, Twitter usually found little evidence that the accounts the FBI flagged had ties to foreign influence. Is that correct?
In part, but we received many reports from the FBI, particularly related to malign foreign interference, that were highly credible and were constructive. So I would say it was a bit of a mixed bag.
And you pushed back to the FBI when they would send you a list of American-based accounts. Is that correct?
Politely, but yes.
Mr. Roth, it appears that Twitter employees were under pressure by the FBI and other government agencies to validate these theories of foreign influence. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't agree with the word pressure. The FBI was quite careful and quite consistent to request review of the accounts, but not to cross the line into advocating for Twitter to take any particular action.
So flagging American accounts, in your view, is not foreign or theories of foreign influence. There's not pressure there just by flagging it to you.
Again,
domestic accounts.
I don't think it's a great use of the Bureau's time, but I wouldn't characterize how they communicated with us as pressure.
Mr. Roth, you enjoyed these meetings with the FBI, it seems, based on the tweets behind me or the communications behind me. In internal communications at Twitter, you said, "Definitely not meeting with the FBI, I swear." Is that correct?
I believe I was joking with a colleague at the time, but yes.
But I can assume that you were meeting with the FBI when you were communicating with your colleague. Is that correct?
Yes, one of my job responsibilities was meeting with law enforcement about election security.
And just so I'm clear, the person you're communicating with here says, "Very boring business meeting that is definitely not about Trump." I assume that's also sarcasm.
Yes, that's my assumption.
And we can assume that Twitter was having these meetings with the FBI about President Trump, correct?
No, sir. The meetings that I was a part of with the FBI were almost entirely and exclusively focused on malign foreign interference, so accounts being operated outside of the United States by other governments, not on the accounts of Americans.
So what is the basis of this communication, then, where you talk about not meeting with Trump or not meeting about Trump?
Again, I think those comments are sarcasm, but the context for this interaction was the need to mark my calendar private after another Twitter employee joined one of those meetings with the FBI unexpectedly. And so I had to implement additional security measures around my calendar. This was a fairly banal interaction with a colleague.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the rest of my time to Mr. Jordan.
Can I ask Mr. Jordan?
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Roth, was there ever any visibility filtering that was hard-coded by Twitter employees into accounts of specific users?
Twitter employees were responsible for building the systems that performed visibility filtering, and then that filtering would have been applied either automatically.
I'm asking a very specific question. I'm asking, was the code written in a way that for certain accounts, those accounts, unique in and of themselves, would be visibility filtering, to use your term, so that they wouldn't have as much reach or as much influence?
The term hard coding suggests that it was permanent and immutable, and I wouldn't agree with that, no.
But it did happen, is what you're saying. There was hard-coded into some of these accounts of specific users by Twitter employees this ability to filter and limit the reach of that particular post, or that particular tweet, I should say.
Again, I wouldn't say that they were hard-coded.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Ms. Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Comer and Ranking Member Raskin, for holding this hearing today. Social media has been a revolutionary gift of the 21st century. From helping people across the world build meaningful connections to learning a new skill set, these platforms have played a significant role in creating an interconnected global world. When handled responsibly, social media serves as a useful resource with many positive outcomes. However, social media is not without its flaws, and the challenges are much larger than any specific incident or decision by one private company. Recently, social media has contributed to the rise and amplification of domestic extremist content and organizing. This is extremely concerning and, unfortunately, is contributing to the division of our society. According to an Anti-Defamation League survey, 66% of the LGBTQ+ respondents, that's a full 2/3, experienced harassment online. 37% of Jewish respondents and 34% of African Americans respondents said the same. This is truly disturbing. The power that social media has to inspire real-world action, both good and bad, is well known to all of us. And sadly, the hate online does not stay online. Social media has the power to influence not just here at home, but those who are watching us abroad. For example, an online disinformation campaign by a hostile foreign power can have the power to sway a close election. So, Mr. Roth, in a recent interview, you stated, and I quote, beginning in 2017, every platform, Twitter included, started to invest really heavily in building out an election integrity function. So I ask, were those investments driven in part by bipartisan concerns raised by Congress and the U.S. government after the Russian influence operation in the 2016 presidential election?
Thank you for the question. Yes, those concerns were fundamentally bipartisan. The Senate's investigation of Russian active measures was a bipartisan effort. The report was bipartisan. And I think we all share concerns with what Russia is doing to meddle in our elections.
Thank you so much. Did those investments include better information sharing mechanisms with the federal government?
Yes. I think one of the key failures that we identified after 2016 was that there was very little information coming from the government and from intelligence services to the private sector. The private sector had the power to remove bots and to take down foreign disinformation campaigns, but we didn't always know where to look without leads supplied by the intelligence community. That was one of the failures highlighted in the Senate Intelligence Committee's report and in the Mueller investigation, and that was one of the things we set out to fix in 2017.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Roth, were those communication channels useful to Twitter as it worked to combat foreign influence operations?
Absolutely. I would say they were one of the most essential pieces of how Twitter prepared for future elections.
Thank you so much. So clearly, we must come together as a committee to stand up and protect our country from foreign election interference and disinformation. I sincerely look forward to spending more time with this committee, working to understand how to fight back against our adversaries and strengthen our democracy. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Ms. Green for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Baker, Ms. Gaddy, Mr. Roth, and Ms. Navaroli, you can consider your speech canceled during my time because you canceled mine. You see, you permanently banned my personal Twitter account, and it was my campaign account also. So let's talk about election interference, shall we? January 2nd, 2002, you permanently banned my Twitter account. This was the account that I would put my campaign ads on, raise money on, fight back when attacked with lies, and be able to talk to my voters in my district. But you banned it. And then let me explain. My account was not reinstated until November 21st, 2022. That was after my election on November 8th. You know, at your company, or your former company where you worked, Twitter employees, over 98% of them donate to Democrats. So while you coordinated with DHS, the FBI, the CIA, our government, and outside groups to permanently ban, shadow ban conservative Americans and candidates like me and the former president of the United States, President Donald J. Trump, you were censoring and wrongfully violating our First Amendment free speech rights. Guess what? None of you hold security clearances. None of you are elected, and none of you represent 750,000 people like I do. Let's explain. 52 United States Law 10101. No person shall intimidate, threaten, coerce, or attempt to stop any other person for the purpose of interfering with their rights to vote or to vote as he may choose. You didn't shadow ban or permanently ban my Democrat opponent. No, you did that to me. And that was wrong, and it was against the law. You see, not only that, was it me that you violated my First Amendment rights, you violated countless conservative Americans. These were doctors that were trying to tell the truth about COVID, doctors that were having success treating people with ivermectin that you all would not allow to be talked about on your platform. These were parents complaining about their school boards, teaching gender lies in their schools, biological males entering their daughters' bathrooms and sports. These were also people questioning the 2020 election, and guess what? That's Americans' First Amendment right. These were people talking about voting machines. You know what? Democrats did that in 2019, before the 2020 election. On Twitter, people could question elections such as 2016, saying Hillary won, but in 2020, no one could question elections saying Trump won. You abuse the power of a large corporation, big tech, to censor Americans. And you want to know something? Guess what? I'm so glad that you're censored down. I'm so glad you've lost your jobs. Thank God Elon Musk bought Twitter. And you know what? Let's talk about something a little bit further. It's amazing to me, Mr. Roth, as the head and trust of safety at Twitter, your ability, or should I say inability, to remove child porn. Now, here's something that disgusts me about you. In your doctoral dissertation entitled Gay Data, you argued that minors should have access to Grindr, an adult male gay hookup app. Minors? Really? You know, Elon Musk took over Twitter and he banned 44,000 accounts that were promoting child porn. You permanently banned my Twitter account, but you allowed child porn all over Twitter. Twitter had become a platform, you said, connecting queer young adults. You also wrote on Twitter in 2010, can high school students ever meaningfully consent to sex with their teachers? In 2021, while you were the director of trust and safety on Twitter, an underage boy and his mother announced a lawsuit against Twitter because Twitter was benefiting from and refused to remove a lewd video featuring this boy and another minor. That is repulsive. But you violated me. What were my tweets? Okay, let's talk about them. I was talking about the deaths being reported on VAERS. By the way, that's on the CDC website. I was also saying that I didn't think any entity should enforce a non-FDA approved vaccine or mask. Guess what? A lot of people agreed with me, but you called that COVID misinformation. By the way, I'm a member of Congress and you're not. I also said the controversial COVID-19 vaccines should not be forced on our military. You want to know something? Republicans stopped that in the NDAA.
Ladies, time has expired.
And your time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roth, please explain to us why Ms. Marjorie Taylor Greene, or the representative from Georgia, was removed from Twitter.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. My recollection is that her personal account was banned from Twitter after repeated written notices due to repeated violations of the Twitter rules.
Can you add a little specificity to the violation of the Twitter rules?
Yes. Again, I didn't have access to my Twitter email, documents, anything that would have let me prepare to answer that in more detail, but my recollection is that the Congresswoman repeatedly violated Twitter's policies about sharing misinformation about COVID-19. She received multiple written warnings about that conduct. She received multiple timeouts related to that conduct. And then ultimately, consistent with the written and published policy, those repeated violations resulted in her account being permanently suspended.
Mr. Chairman,
so in essence,
I'd like to make a point of personal privilege.
It's still my time.
We'll stop
Still my
clock.
It's still my
order,
time.
Mr. Chairman.
Point of order by Mr. Raskin.
Yeah, I don't believe that members of this committee have the right to interrupt someone's testimony because their
Point
name
of
was
personal
mentioned.
privilege.
And-
You were mentioning my name, Mr. Raskin.
Yeah, no, I understand, but that's not the rule, Ms. Green. I don't think a member.
That is the rule in Congress.
Well, then I'd like
we can take a point
I'd like
of
the
personal
parliamentarian
privilege.
to rule on whether any member of this committee has the right to interrupt a witness's testimony because they mentioned the name of a member of Congress.
You mentioned my name, Mr. Raskin.
Yeah, I'm not testifying.
Chair recognizes Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr.
For your
Chairman.
point of privilege, very briefly.
Thank you. For Mr. Roth, who made you in charge of what is true and what's not true?
Does she get to reopen her question?
No, we'll go back to Mr. Gomez, and Mr. Gomez, please remember the decorum of the committee. The clock, we'll restart the clock now. You didn't lose any time. Chair recognizes Mr. Gomez.
Thank you so much. The gentlelady from Georgia was suspended from Twitter for knowingly and consistently spreading conspiracy theories about COVID-19 vaccine, right? Which is shameful, especially in a pandemic where a million people have lost their lives. With that, I yield my rest of my time to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Gomez. Let's talk about these so-called Twitter files, which my Republican colleagues seem to think are God's gift to journalism. In one about the Hunter Biden laptop, the author says that every single fact in the New York Post story was accurate. And Chairman Comer, I notice you blew up the cover of that New York Post story, which I appreciate you doing that because I'd like to dig into this article. The very first paragraph says Hunter Biden introduced his father to a top executive at a Ukrainian energy firm less than a year before the elder Biden pressured government officials in Ukraine into firing a prosecutor who was investigating the company. That is false. 100% false.
Is the gentleman sure about that?
Yes. In fact, I am sure about that. And as the lead counsel in the first impeachment investigation, we proved that he was actually fired because he was not prosecuting corruption, not that he was fired because he was prosecuting corruption.
Corruption of the president's son's company. I'm sorry, would the gentleman yield corruption of the president's son's company?
I'd like to reclaim my time.
Gentleman's recognized.
The fact that Joe Biden fired, consistent with U.S. policy in every single European country, the prosecutor general in Ukraine because he did not prosecute corruption, including at companies like Burisma, has been proven over and over and over. And if you want to know who actually prosecuted Burisma, Chairman Comer, you should talk to the British authorities, because they were the ones who were prosecuting Burisma, and they couldn't get any cooperation from the Ukrainian prosecutor general. So that's why he was fired. So right off the top, the very first paragraph of this so-called bombshell story is completely false. Now, what is the allegation that we are hearing from our Republican colleagues about the connection to Joe Biden and Burisma? It is an email from a Burisma employee thanking Hunter Biden for organizing a meeting with the Vice President Biden. We know nothing about the substance of that meeting. We know nothing about how long they met. It was not on Vice President Biden's schedule. And in fact, I would ask my Republican colleagues, do you meet with foreign businessmen? Do you meet with foreign diplomats? If we were to say to you every single time you met with somebody that you discussed something that you're voting on, how would you react? It's preposterous. And Chairman Comer, you have said in your opening statement that Joe Biden lied to the American people. That is a bold, bold accusation. And so far, we've seen no actual evidence of any lies or any support for Joe Biden being involved in anything having to do with Ukraine other than promoting U.S. foreign policy. And I hope that you are not abusing the power as chairman of this committee
and that you are not wasting taxpayer dollars on a fishing expedition into a civilian child of a president for political purposes. I yield back.
The gentleman yield to a quick question. You don't have to. It's your choice. You yield.
Yeah, please.
So
I would love to discuss this.
are you admitting that Joe Biden did get the prosecutor in Ukraine fired?
I think it's very clear that Vice President Biden, along with all of our allies in Europe, pressured Ukraine to fire a corrupt prosecutor general who was not charging corruption cases that would have included potentially Burisma.